I think philosophy of science can offer a lot to contemporary society. And I think this is often forgotten, and I think it's badly needed, actually, and needed more so with each year. So philosophers of science, they typically learn a bunch of science. And so in my case, I learned a lot of physics when I was younger. Others might learn biology or economics, and then they participate in the foundational issues that go on in those fields. But if you think about what's going on in society today, you have all of these areas where you can see that just further advances in the science won't really help. So think of something like the climate crisis. There's a lot of good work in climate science, of course, and there are many philosophical questions in climate science. But really, when you start to think about what path a country should go, or companies should go, or universities should go in dealing with this, you quickly get to all these other questions and that really are much more philosophical in nature. And so you need somebody who has some technical skills so they can understand the science, but also a background training that includes these different issues in philosophy of science, but also things like ethics and all the other things you get trained with in a philosophy PhD. So for instance, with climate change, for instance, in economics, you'll have all these cost-benefit analyses about what paths forward are the best ones. They will all, put in a particular number for how to discount the future harms and benefits. Where does that number come from? It doesn't come from anything you look out at in the world, and so you need to discuss this, and so it has real effects. And so you need to, somebody with the skill set of a philosopher of science, I think, is well equipped to look at that, because they can understand the fine details of the economics, but also think, they have their head up outside the narrow domain of economics, and will look at ethics and justice and things like that. But that's so increasingly for everything. So we see philosophers of science tackling issues in medicine. We see them tackling issues with data science, with bias and AI and algorithms. In particular, when we think of the rise of misinformation that the public is getting. Is a really good question, and I can see it. I can see both sides of it, and actually some of the work I do is exploring both sides of this. So on the one hand, I sit on the International Science Council, which is of the global voice of science. I sit on their panel on scientific freedom and scientific responsibility. And there are many scientists throughout the world who are really challenged in terms of their scientific freedom. The type of science they do, gets them into trouble with the government, trouble with, different groups who harass them. In some places, people are jailed. In other places, they're silenced. And so the International Science Council, along with a bunch of other groups like Scholars at Risk, will make statements and try to exert international pressure to let these scientists have their scientific freedom. So they should be able to have freedom of mobility. They should have freedom to work on what they want to work on. They should have freedom to publicly express this science. And so some of the work is actually on whistleblowers who will make a statement, say, about pollution in some area that maybe is unwelcome to a particular government somewhere. They should be rewarded for their courage in standing up and saying something that they found in their science, rather than being persecuted. But I do think that the scientific freedom comes at a it's not a sort of one-to-one sort of thing, but where you buy your scientific freedom for the price of it is that your work is toward the public good. not every scientist's work has to be, done, explicitly for the public good. If you're a mathematician and you work in number theory, it's going to be hard to see how it's not going to help poor children find more food or anything like that. But on the other hand, it is a real good, if we're contributing to public knowledge of anything. And so, but anyway, the idea is that the scientific freedom comes with that you should at least pursue the science in a socially responsible way. And so then that raises difficult questions. Should you pursue science? Are there certain topics of research that should be prohibited, restricted? Well, that question is sort of ill-formed, because you could imagine a society where you had freedom to pursue everything, but maybe not every research topic, but maybe not freedom, but maybe there's nothing that says that the government or different funding agencies need to fund it. And so, for instance, if you think, of topics like racial differences with regard to IQ, or that, the philosopher of science, Philip Kitcher, famously said that, in the US, that sort of work, should not be, maybe not allowed, but not encouraged or funded, because whatever was found wouldn't be useful or helpful to the least well-off in the society. And so there you can see that it's not a sort of heavy hand on the restricting scientific freedom, but maybe more like a soft hand, say, not funding that kind of thing. But there's also issues about sort of funding. And this is one thing I'm very interested in right now. So you have different industry groups fund scientists, researchers, not just scientists. Does academic freedom mean that you have the freedom to take any type of funding you want, even if that funding is coming from groups that are working explicitly against the public good? And maybe you think, well, they could take whatever funding they want, but they should at least disclose that. And so I'm very interested in getting disclosure policies passed. So it's familiar to most scientists in that if you give a talk or you publish in a particular journal, that you'll have to disclose your potential financial and non-financial conflicts of interest. But that's not really uniform across many different areas. And so there are many high-profile scandals where professors have basically done research for hire for fossil fuel industries and not disclosed that. That to me is really just pretty disgusting. And there should be different sorts of transparency requirements. So I like kind of sunshine laws, thinking that, or regulations at universities, where, I think the tried and true method of dealing with dark money is to shine light on it. It makes dark money less useful to the industry. Yeah, so is science dangerous? Some people see science as dangerous, and you can really understand where people come from when they think about this. So there are many proposals, and I've been working on some of these through my institute, where you have technological advances that are dual use. Now, dual use science, dual use research and technology is a common thing. I mean, in some sense, everything is dual use. So a hammer you could use to murder someone, or you could build a house for a homeless person with it. And so a hammer is dual use. But I think when people are thinking about science being dangerous, the idea is that there's some scientific advances that where the beneficial uses are going to be really small, and the costs are really potentially catastrophic. So here, think about things like climate geoengineering. So there's different methods where you could try to engineer the climate. Some of them are actually not science fiction. You could really start doing this very soon if you wanted to. It would have an effect on the climate. We know, from looking at various volcanoes that they can have tremendous effects on the climate, and you could mimic some of this. But if you did so, all these sort of ethical questions will come up. Who would decide to do that? Who would decide to continue to do it? Because if you stop doing it, it could be disastrous. How would you police this? There would be winners and losers in this kind of thing. So if you mess with the climate, you will change things for better in some areas and worse in other areas. Would the resulting distribution be just? Would it benefit just the rich countries? So there's all sorts of questions like that. Of course, also in biology, so the Institute for Practical Ethics has had a project on gene drives for a few years. And gene drives are a kind of new way of doing genetic modification. Old style gene modification would just, you'd modify the individual and it would either pass the trait on or not. And you just have the kind of Mendelian inheritance patterns take over. With the gene drive, you can force the trait to occur in the offspring. So you can just fill up the whole subsequent populations with that trait. So it unleashes a kind of effectively irreversible chain reaction through a population. So again, now you can imagine, now this is like super dual use, because you could imagine attempts to modify mosquitoes so that they can't transmit malaria. Well, now over 400,000 people per year die of malaria. Most of them are poor children. It's a huge, terrible cost to humanity. If you could do this, it'd be amazing. On the other hand, gene drives you could imagine being weaponized to take out another country's agriculture. There's all sorts of nightmare scenarios you can imagine. Maybe even doing good, trying to do good, like with mosquitoes, maybe that would end up causing some sort of ecological disaster. So there's all these sorts of questions, and so you can understand why somebody might be afraid of all these kind of what's sometimes called techno fixes to fix problems, because you could think, well, maybe what we should do is not emit as much CO2, and then we wouldn't have to geoengineer, and maybe we should help people so that they're not so poor and susceptible to malaria, and then you don't need to release gene drive mosquitoes. Coming back to the other question, there's a good place where a philosopher of science can come in, because they will know some of the ethics and justice literature, but also they'll have a good understanding of the science. Yeah, well, thinking about the Institute for Practical Ethics, what places that are great areas for philosophers of science and ethicists and scientists to work together. I mean, there's so many, but some of them really stand out. One in particular is, of course, with AI and data science. It's no secret that data science is taking over the world. The things that used to be the huge companies and the huge industries have also fallen to all the big data companies. You can then see, both the pluses and the minuses of the data revolution. And if we think about the minuses, you can think about, in certain countries, you have really repressive governments going after particular groups. They're really using AI as a weapon. You can have facial recognition technology at every street corner. Phones can be monitored with location information, who you've texted, who you've not texted. And there's all these kind of more speculative types of technology, such as that don't currently work all that well, but things like go right from your DNA to drawing your face. Now, of course, it doesn't work all that well, because your path through life might change to your face, whether you have a beard or not, or a scar, or you're heavy or thick, or something like that. But still, all of these things can add up to the probability being higher and higher that you pass in front of a camera, and the Chinese government knows that you are a member of the Uyghur population. They might know that you've started going out your back door rather than your front door. all sorts of other things. This is affect recognition systems happening and again being used in some schools in different countries where students are being monitored, and whether they're happy or not is sort of being read off, whether they're paying attention. All of these things can be read off from your these systems that are looking at you. Again, you have the dual use issue. Some of these things might be really useful. So if it's an affect recognition system and it's put into your car and it tells you, Craig, you're falling asleep now, maybe pull over. Well, and if I get to control whether it's on or off and that, then really it seems like it's a really useful device. On the other hand, you can then imagine all these ways in which it can be disastrous. It's hard not to get depressed about thinking about climate. When you look at how long we've known about climate change, and not only have we not done that much, we as those of us from countries who have put out most of it and have most of the capability of doing something about reining it in, we've made things worse. And so that's kind of the way it is with almost all of the big environmental problems, is that we recognize the problem, and then instead of fixing it, we tend to make things even worse. And so you could think of also things like plastic and plastic pollution and stuff. And we just keep putting out more and more plastic. We keep putting out more and more CO2. And so it's hard not to get depressed. On the other hand, so I teach environmental ethics, and I taught environmental ethics for the first time in 1994. And well, back then, that we would think about nuclear energy and stuff, and didn't even talk about climate change much. But when I teach all the students, I do come away, I read all the material, all the climate science, and it becomes very depressing. But then I go into the classroom and meet all these young students with all these ideas and that, and I walk out of the classroom optimistic. And so I sort of shift back and forth from looking at if I zoom way out, then I'm always very pessimistic. But then when I meet all these students, then do start to see some reasons for optimism. Do seem to see a shift in things. More and more big entities are trying to be a bit more green. Of course, sometimes that's just sort of just greenwashing. But in other cases, it's really not. So for instance, the town I live in, I think next year, all the residents will have their electricity sourced entirely from renewables, which, that's amazing. How many of these things are scalable? I'm not sure. There you can get depressed a little bit again, but you can definitely see signs for optimism. For me, if I had to pick one thing that makes me a bit optimistic, it's the fact that the economic growth and carbon emissions decoupled many years ago. And so it used to be that you thought that if you had to decrease carbon emissions, you're sinking a country's economic growth. Now, maybe that would be okay for rich countries like the US and Britain, but it was a hard thing to argue that people in poor areas should have, not have the benefits of a better life because, your country has put all the, use the CO2 sink already. But now if you have this sort of decoupling between growth and CO2 emissions, there's you don't have to make that kind of hard bargain anymore. And so I do think that you could have growth without CO2 emissions going up. That's really, really big. That's a huge thing to hold on to if you're trying to find some reason to be optimistic when you're looking forward.
For more debates, talks and interviews, subscribe today to the Institute of Art and Ideas at IAI TV.